you're no longer restricted to sort of the localized, sort of traditional way to think about fans. And I think that's a huge opportunity. But you're right, every way that you consume content now, whether it's your TV or it's your mobile device, you're connected. And so that just, sends us loads of signals in terms of, really understanding who a fan is.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Identity Architects, the InfoSum podcast that spotlights the leaders in the media industry shaping the future of data-driven advertising. I'm your host Ben Cicchetti, and this week I had the opportunity to sit down with Jamie Williams, Chief Customer Officer and co-founder of the CLV Group. Together, Jamie and I discussed the current state of sports marketing, the role that data plays today, the impact of social media, and much, much more. Before we jump into that conversation, this is a reminder to hit that subscribe button to be alerted when new episodes of Identity Architects are available. Without any further delay, here's my chat with Jamie. Jamie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited to dig into the world of sports marketing and CLV Group. But for anyone who doesn't know you, can you just give us a quick introduction to yourself and CLV Group?
Yeah, of course. Jamie Williams, I'm the Chief Customer Officer and the co-founder of CLV Group. We develop data strategies for fan acquisition and engagement for brands in the sports and entertainment vertical. So spend a lot of time thinking about fandom and fan engagement and all things that are really helping that space kind of transform at the moment.
I love that. And we're recording this just a few short days after the Super Bowl, which is obviously a massive fan engagement moment.
Absolutely.
So this is very well timed. And we'll dig into all of that. But we'll start the way we always do, which is with our quick fire questions to get to know you a little bit better. Starting with, what's your earliest memory of advertising?
I actually have quite a few. The one that stands out to me the most is probably most relevant for people in sort of the millennial generation who grew up in the Midwest, because we had this set of commercials that aired for an insurance company like Eagle Man Insurance or Eagle Insurance. And I bet anybody around my age could recite that 30-second ad beginning to end, because it just played all the time and it was absolutely hysterical. That is definitely one of my earlier memories. I also really vividly remember when McDonald's was doing quite a few things. They did the Beanie Baby piece, but they also did that Monopoly game.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people actually who worked on McDonald's at the time, and I know we can kind of chat about that, but it just stood out as so interesting. I was really starting to understand what was happening and why that was connected to things like a Super Bowl commercial, for example. And yeah, a couple of things like that, I guess, stand out.
I love that. So if you take yourself back to those days, seeing those commercials for the first time, what did you want to be when you were younger, when you were growing up?
A mix of things. I definitely always thought about being a teacher, which I think is probably a pretty common response to this. I had a moment where I thought I'd be a marine biologist, also wondering how common that is, but I'm not sure. I actually I really did want to get into advertising, as like cheesy as that sounds. I really did want to get into advertising pretty young, simply because I actually knew people in the business, and they're mentors of mine still to this day. They were mentors of mine to get into the industry. And I took an advertising art class in high school, and it drew me in. And honestly, I really didn't even consider anything else going into college and starting my career. So as cheesy as that sounds, it was actually advertising.
That's pretty amazing, and you've achieved it, which is incredible. What was your first job in advertising then?
So I worked for a boutique digital agency. They were actually a startup and an offshoot here in Chicago for a traditional media firm. So there had been, media planning and buying expertise out of this agency for decades, and everything was above the line. So print, television, radio, and my CEO at the time, and I worked with him I was there for 5 or 6 years. It was him and I at the beginning, and I was an account coordinator, but really I was sort of whatever needed to be done. So I was a media planner one day, and I really just was able to kind of jump in and participate in planning and buying very quickly, which was fantastic. He grew the agency out to I think 25 or 30 people by the time I left, but it was an absolutely incredible experience. Actually, the level of grit and that bug I got right away for startup environments. I don't think I'll ever shake, to be honest. So it was a ton of fun. Ton of fun.
Yeah, it sounds it. So, what do you think it was? Obviously, you mentioned this was kind of a dream you've had for a long time. What do you think it was that drew you into the advertising industry in the first place? And then, I guess, what keeps you in it to this day?
Yeah, I really think it's the creativity, which I'm not in production. I've actually never been on the traditional creative side of things, but I've always been able to leverage so I used to draw and dance, and so I have sort of that creative background, but applying it to media, ironically, and now data has been a great outlet for me. And I don't
Mm.
know how I've been able to really tap into that, but there's always a problem to solve. There's always something new to kind of challenge the space or transform what we're doing. I look back at starting in digital at a time when I had clients who used to ask me, but how do people get online? How do they get, and okay, right. So I'm showing you a Yahoo homepage takeover, and you're not quite sure yet what Yahoo is, and
Yeah.
and so, which is just so interesting to think about. But it's been consistent in my career. There's always something new to kind of work through with clients, a new problem to solve. It keeps me interested. It just always has.
Yeah, I agree. The constant change for me is kind of one of the biggest selling points. Like, I think I'd
Yeah,
get bored if it was the same every day.
yeah.
So it's an industry that never gets old. There's always a new challenge ahead. But obviously, that can make it a challenging industry as well. So, what advice would you give to someone that's maybe just starting out in their career in advertising?
I I find that, and this was true for me, I struggle to figure out the way in the first place. And until you're really on the inside, I don't think you necessarily appreciate just how many avenues you can look to and have a really successful career in media and advertising. So what I like to tell people that I mentor is, think about every product you use, every website you go to, every app you download. They all have a marketing department. They all have partnering agencies that support them. They all have platforms they use behind the scenes. And when you start to really unpack it that way and kind of show, I think, what sits behind the scenes for people that are on this side, I think that's really helpful because it really feels so, I think, overwhelming to too many when there's really so much opportunity for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. It can feel like, and there's a lot going on, right? So it's knowing that it can feel like there's only a two or three roles, maybe, or two or three kind of worlds you can enter into within the advertising industry. But as you say, when you break it down into the tech, into the agencies, into the brands, into the media owners, and into everyone else in between, there's kind of a plethora of different opportunities out
It
there.
That's exactly it. And honestly, I think my once you're in, my biggest piece of advice is to try it all, because
Mm,
I don't think, and I look back and sort of followed a kind of zigzaggy career and tried, the agency side, tried brand side, tried, I was in SaaS for a while. I was on the sales side, and with that comes, I think, just so many different pieces of what, you kind of figure out you enjoy, what you're really good at. And so I would encourage people, just because you start in sales, you don't necessarily have to stay in sales. I think that trying a little bit of everything it would be my recommendation.
yeah, and I think it's probably what makes you a good leader as well, because you've understood all the different aspects. It just allows you kind of to have a better level of empathy with those people that you might be dealing with, where you're not doing their job, but you kind of understand aspects of what they're doing.
It's so
And I
true.
think that makes a big difference.
So true.
A two-part question. What keeps you awake at night? And then what gets you up and motivated in the morning?
For a two-part question, I think my answer is actually the same.
Okay.
It's the people that I work with. It's the team that I work with every day, and it's the clients that we service. What keeps me up at night is, did we get everything done? Did we get everything? Did we do the best we could? Did we answer their questions? Is there more that we could do? And what gets me up in the morning is, we're going to have more questions to answer today, and we've got more things to do. And so my job is to be the best coach I possibly can to my team, even to my clients. They're the ones on the front line that are going to bring, really ultimately deliver the ideas that we're building and are building towards. And so, was I the best coach I could be, yesterday? I think that's what keeps me going.
I love that. I often say that I think the best leaders are coaches. Like, I think that's a better word for it. I think because that's what they do. They bring out the best in their teams. They bring out the best in their clients. So I love to hear that. We've touched on how complicated the industry is. How would you describe what you do within media and advertising to a 10-year-old?
Yeah. So now I can describe it a little bit easier than I used to be able to, because we spend so much time in sport and so much time in entertainment. Inevitably, everybody is a fan of something. So
Mm.
to be able to say, you love Lionel Messi, and what you want to do is see all the videos that he wants to create and give you, which could be tips and tricks before, a game, or something similar to that. My job is to help him find his fans and figure out where they are. And so you love spending time on Roblox or on Fortnite. My job is to make sure that those videos and that content finds its way to you and your friends who are also fans of him.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great way to put it. I love that. The final of our quick fire questions, and it's my favorite because it always gives me a little bit of a unique insight into everyone that I get to speak to on this podcast. If there was a song that was a soundtrack to your life, what would it be?
This question cracks me up. So, Under Pressure would be the song I would choose by my friend Freddie. I For a couple of reasons actually. I thrive in pressure, and I think actually healthy pressure, like in such a literal sense, healthy pressure is actually a really good thing for brands, for businesses, people to think differently. And so I have kind of found myself in those scenarios often, and I do well in those environments. But I also feel like it's a connector of people, of generations. I mean, I who doesn't love that song? And
Yeah.
and I from both a personal perspective, but also from a professional perspective, I often find myself being that sort of connector of people. And are we saying the same thing? Or are you saying the same thing, but you're actually just saying it differently? And, um, I take a lot of pride in that. So that's what it is.
Amazing choice. I love that choice. And we have a playlist on Spotify which we add everyone's songs to,
Amazing.
and it's become a really really cool playlist
I
over
love
the
it.
years. So we'll add that, and everyone can enjoy it. As you say, you can't not love that song.
Yeah.
Let's dig into some of the more topic related questions. Let's dig into sports marketing because it's an area that I've had less exposure to than other areas. So I'm really interested to kind of get into the basics of it. Can you give me an overview of what we mean when we say sports marketing? Is it new? And if not, how has it evolved in recent years?
Absolutely. It's definitely not new. But it's having sort of a moment right now in terms of an inflection point and some transformation that I think is really interesting. When we talk about sports marketing, we're really talking about the commercial arm of a sports business, and brands like McDonald's or United Airlines will pay for the right to leverage the likeness of a team or a league or an athlete, and the combination of those three we would call a rights holder. So it's that commercial relationship between the two. Um, that has existed for a very long time, and it's been a source of helping brands drive relevancy, drive awareness, drive purchase intent. And what the rights holders on the other side of the table, the teams, for example, or the leagues, have to do is they have to really maximize the experience for a fan when they're at the stadium. Are you having the best time you possibly could be having, and are they monetizing that experience? Is that match or that game available to you when you're at home, and what do those broadcast relationships look like? what's unique about this time period, I guess, post COVID, is that there's so many fans that are unknown to those rights holders or to those athletes because they don't necessarily have to be in the stadium anymore.
Right.
And there was a time when they couldn't be. So okay, how does that change the role of that live experience? And so that fan engagement, if you will, now can be driven by more of a digital experience. I could be a fan here in Chicago to Chelsea in the UK, and I don't ever have to actually attend a match. And so how do you monetize me as a fan, but also how do you understand who I am better, and how do you leverage a ton of data signals that help you sort of have a clearer view of who I am and people who are similar to me over here in the US, for example.
Yeah, and obviously you mentioned data, and obviously that's something that is now just an incredible asset no matter what industry you're in. So how has the role of data strategy, I guess, evolved in sports and in entertainment? And what do you see as kind of the most critical component of implementing an effective data strategy?
So the traditional, I would say, approach it still exists in that the people who have bought tickets, the people who and when I say you, a rights holder, a league, the NBA knows the people that have purchased tickets, maybe who have purchased merchandise also on e-commerce, and so enriching that data, that first party data, is really important, and it gives you the traditional customer 360 view. What's different now taps back into what I was just talking about in terms of the global fandom. And so they have a ton of unknown fans. And I think we'll talk about social media quite a bit today, but a social channel, an Instagram page, for example, does not replace CRM data, but you have to figure out a way to find those unknown fans, identify them, and then you can leverage really interesting signals now to understand them even better so that their relevancy, in the way you engage with them just goes up. But that unknown fan piece, who are identifying those unknown fans, I would say that's the biggest change, and also the biggest opportunity at the moment.
Yeah, and I guess that comes from the fact that we are heading into, or we're actually in this digital first era. As consumers, we manage our lives primarily digitally first, whether it's our banking, whether it's our shopping, and obviously whether it's how we kind of engage with sports teams and sports stars, I guess, even more so. How's that changing the kind of sports marketing landscape with just so many different touch points that fans can have with sports teams? And what are some of the kind of examples of how that data is driving this transition to that digital first era?
Yeah. I mean, it has unlocked, I think, a whole new view of who fans are. It's probably also even drawn in more fans because the accessibility is so much greater than it used to
Yeah.
be. And and even just a an athlete having a YouTube channel, that's a very different experience for Gen Alpha than what we would have experienced as millennials even. And so you're no longer restricted to sort of the localized, sort of traditional way to think about fans, and I think that's a huge opportunity. But you're right, every way that you consume content now, whether it's your TV or it's your mobile device, you're connected, and so that just sends us loads of signals in terms of really understanding who a fan is. What what I find really interesting is when we're able to actually connect those signals though to other things.
Mm,
So not only do I now have the opportunity to understand who's watching, Chelsea, for example, regularly, I also have that entire spectrum, the other side of that spectrum, of people who watch every once in a while.
yeah.
Where do they engage on social? And then also, how do they transact, whether it's with me or not? What else do they buy? Do they buy in retail and merchandise? Do they buy sneakers? All of that stuff helps us, really sort of bring different ways to engage with fans to life and becomes sort of the backdrop to those strategies.
Yeah, so let's dig into the fan, because obviously that's kind of the center of all of this. With this shift to a more data-driven approach, how are you seeing organizations, sports teams, and everyone in between kind of enhancing that fan engagement through these marketing strategies?
I think it right now at the moment anyway, it's really about richer experiences. So that is custom content, that could be customized merchandise, bringing a stadium or a live experience to to your fans elsewhere, so creating more of a virtual experience. I think that is a game changer for the way fans want to engage with these rights holders. And especially in the US, it's so fragmented over here. There's so much sport available that say F1, which has exploded recently in the US, even soccer, as that continues to grow ahead of the World Cup. There's having a better sense for where is that share of time already, where are people watching, what are they spending time watching by way of sport. That helps them change, I think, some of the traditional ways they would engage with customers or fans. Far more customized though than I think we've ever seen before.
Yeah, and I think, or I suspect, one of the biggest drivers for that has been social media, right? And the impact that that's had on the fan experience. I think about, if I'm on the tube and I look around, there are a lot of people who are watching sports on TikTok or Instagram Reels. I think about how my nephews engage and my nieces engage with sports. It's all kind of through their phone, whether that's social media or something else. How are you seeing teams leveraging data to enhance the social media interactions even further?
It's a great question because it's such a an important point of engagement for a fan. But from a marketing perspective, it's only one piece of the pie.
Mm.
And I think that is a really important thing to take away from what it allows you to do, the way it allows you to engage. You can distribute content, you can acquire fans, you can sell merchandise. I mean, all of that is available on these social channels. But just to reference what I had mentioned before, it doesn't replace that direct relationship that you have with somebody. And I think that is easily confused, and a social following on Meta is owned by Meta.
Mm.
That fan relationship is owned by Meta. Same thing with X. You still have to acquire those fans into your space to have that direct relationship and to understand more about them. And I think that's the piece that gets maybe overlooked a little bit in sport. And this is, I think, just part of the transition ultimately that everybody's going through. But it is a key distribution channel. Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess especially for the content, right? I mean, if it's not social media, but if we talk about F1, my impression is that one of the biggest drivers of the boom we've seen in the US has been the Netflix series around
Absolutely.
F1, right? So that content is such a big driver to the stadiums or to the channels that are broadcasting it, and part of kind of the distribution, to your point, is social media. And obviously, you touched on something there, which you also touched on at our Info Summit in November. You came over to London, you spoke at our Info Summit, which was amazing. And there you mentioned talking about kind of these unknown fans. You mentioned the challenges of lookalike modeling in sports marketing. Can you explain what this challenge is and kind of outline the alternative strategies that teams and CLV Group and others are kind of taking to engage with those fans?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because lookalike modeling is a very successful tactic to most brands, to most businesses, and it's predicated on the concept that birds of a feather will flock together, and it makes sense. When you think about sports fans, it's so personal in many many scenarios that it's not necessarily going to be it's a tactic that has to be applied in the right ways. Meaning, if you are well, actually, we'll take Chicago as an example. So someone like myself, if you were to put me into a lookalike model or use me as a seed audience for, say, White Sox fans, on paper, the people that you would connect me to and the data you would use to draw in other fans, we would look really similar. I mean, from a zip code perspective, from a life stage perspective, all the traditional ways that you're going to use, even our interests, the way you're going to use an algorithm to build that model is going to look very similar. But I can tell you, point blank that I've got loads of friends and family who are Cubs fans.
Yeah.
And so how do you just, differentiate the two of us? Well, you've got to layer in other parts to that algorithm. You have to see what content we're watching. You have to understand what type of merchandise we buy. And therein lies sort of the ability to distinguish the two. It's no different from being able to distinguish a Man City and a Man United fan. And so it's very difficult to do it using traditional methods. There's a time and a place for it, but yeah, it definitely takes a different it plays a different role, I guess, for sport.
Yeah, and thinking about those algorithms and the signals that obviously a lot of people are taking in, how are algorithms used to normalize those signals, enhance the understanding of sports marketing, and how can organizations kind of identify the what I would guess call unusual connections within their fan base using data? Because again, at Info Summit, you talked about an anime example, which I love. So maybe you can share that with us as well. But how is that working?
Yeah. So the first piece, and this is where we spend a lot of time with our clients. The first piece is identifying what we would call the unknown fan. So the people who have not bought from you directly, have not, been to a game yet, or never will because they live in in a different market. So the first piece is being able to identify them, and we actually create sort of a scoring system that allows you to assess our view on the confidence that somebody is a fan.
Okay.
And what that means is we actually have to build an algorithm around that fan, so we have to connect multiple data sets, multiple signals to give you a sense for whether or not somebody is a fan. And that identification is the first piece. We then use that, base as a way to profile that unknown fan, because you have to figure out the best way to acquire them, to bring them over to what is really your first party data set. And understanding if somebody's going to be drawn in by custom content or by specific types of merchandise is really helpful. Unique partnerships where there's a high affinity to something that can sit, very naturally alongside the rights holder, is a great way to do that. So we found, for example, with a club in the UK, that their global fans here in the US actually had a higher affinity for anime than they did for other sports here in the US. And that could be an indicator for generational preferences, or just generational differences. But that's kind of a, sort of a nugget of information that can be used to create some really interesting and different experiences for the fan and draw them in to your first party data set. So, and CRM ultimately. So we're helping sort of build those algorithms with the clients.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating to me because I consider myself a content marketer at heart. So understanding what content is going to resonate with the fan base, right? Understanding where that content should be served. To give examples, I'm also low key obsessed with in-game advertising, as everyone knows at this point. Understanding, are my fans more likely to be on Roblox versus Fortnite? Are my fans more likely to be playing Madden on the PlayStation or on the Xbox? So kind of having those signals to know where you can reach them and what their habits are, I just find fascinating from kind of a content marketing
I
perspective.
do too. I definitely geek out over it. So I get it.
I love that. Let's talk about the teams because we kind of skirted around them a little bit, but let's kind of get into the sports teams themselves. In what ways are those teams preparing for success with these data initiatives? And what are kind of some of the best practices that you can share regarding, I guess, team structure and collaboration?
Yeah, I guess in terms of setting up for success, more, I would say more just rights holders in general are investing in the space. They're investing in sourcing data and having different conversations with their partners about what kind of data can be shared. And of course, clean rooms and those, you know, privacy safe ways to actually share data, with, or collaborate rather, with one of your partners, starts to like really fuel a lot of that. So that makes things, I think, a lot different than they used to be, which is great. And then sourcing some incremental data to round out that knowledge, identify those unknown fans, consider what opportunities you want to create for engagement. That's how they're preparing. Now, I would say from a structural perspective, it's a big change for these commercial teams that are arguably a bit more transactional or have been more transactional in the past. And so people who are experts in data architecture and data analysis historically would sit separate from the frontline marketers that are coming up with the communication strategies, and all of a sudden those groups need to be brought so much tighter together. And what I love to see, and we're seeing so much more often now, is it's less about relying on a survey to answer some questions and then put ideas in market. It's about saying to, these analysts and these data strategists, what do you think we should do? What will be the right thing for our fan base? How should we segment our fan base so that we're maybe giving even, less mass engagement opportunities and more customized experiences for our base? And yeah, it's changed the way that structure has to be built, and probably at some point we'll create a new role or team structure, within these businesses. But right now it's really about bringing the stakeholders together.
Yeah, and can you kind of envisage what that future structure or future roles would look like, and elaborate on kind of how this integration is kind of happening and what those new roles that are emerging might be?
I mean, I think it will be driven by data strategy at its core. I think what I've seen happen in loads of different ways is we at one point as an industry we're using data solely for enrichment and reconciliation, and really using offline data to accomplish that. Then all of a sudden we've got all of this digital data, and for media buying and planning, and people are using that the way that they are, and successfully. But it's like it's the combination of those two things, and it's the media groups that historically are familiar with, media analytics, really starting to appreciate, okay, but what does offline data look like? And what does this mean for our customers? And not just to report, but to actually make, planning decisions up front, and then use that same data to validate the performance and measure. And so we describe it as more data strategy. I think there's probably multiple people that play that role in a variety of ways, but it really is that, I think that's the link at the moment.
Yeah, I love that. It's super interesting. And look, this has been such an interesting conversation. As we said at the start, sports marketing is something that's really, it's not new. It's been around for a long time, but it's kind of going through this change as a lot of media channels are. So getting to pick your brains and getting to kind of learn more about the sports marketing landscape, what CLV Group is doing in that space, has been super fascinating for me. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I look forward to seeing even more in the future.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks again to Jamie for being on the podcast. It was great to learn more about the current sports marketing landscape and understand how everyone from brands and sports teams are unlocking the value of data to drive better fan experiences. All that's left for me to do is to remind you to hit that subscribe button to know when the next episode of Identity Architects lands. But until then, thanks for listening.